I've always wondered if interest groups are just a reality of our government. I'm your host, Christopher Balgren, the host of the Open Minds podcast, where I'm trying to explore the biggest issues of our world with genuine curiosity. So definitely leave a like, subscribe, comment below, let me know what you think and how complex it is. I mean, our government is just so complex. I was reading somewhere that 16,000 bills were put forward in 2020, and of them, just a few hundred passed. Makes sense after all. I mean, you think about it, you're a congressperson, you put a bill on the floor, it has to pass the initial reading, it then gets submitted to committee for experts and others to weigh in, then it has to pass both houses, and then of course it has to go to the president, and the president can still veto it. So interest groups naturally lend themselves to this process. I mean, it's just so complicated. I mean, interest groups with deep pockets could just pay researchers, experts, to pass bills that are in their own interests. And then on the civil society side, I mean, you have interest groups who can pressure us to think a certain way on any given issue. I mean, when you think about it, how many of us are personally connected to a lot of the political issues that we may have strong opinions about? And interest groups can, put forward strong media campaigns to pressure us to think a certain way about any given topic. And so you think about this complex society that we've created, it's like it just lends itself to interest groups. Our governments are too complicated. The issues that we feel passionate about are so complicated. I mean, interest groups are literally swooping in and can co-opt government to act in a very specific way. And there's so many examples of this. Take, for example, ethanol. See, back in the early 2000s, there was a coordinated effort by not-for-profit groups, interest groups, to get more ethanol into our fuel mix for cars. This would reduce our dependency on fossil fuels as well. Ethanol is this biofuel made mostly from corn. The US government was actually pressured into putting forward an act where all fuel needs to be, I think, 30% mixed with ethanol. Well, 20 years later, it's been shown that ethanol is actually bad for the environment. It uses a ton of arable land to produce enough ethanol for the average vehicle. There's almost 300 million vehicles in the United States, so there would need a lot of ethanol production for that, leading to hundreds of millions of arable land for ethanol to actually make it into each vehicle. But also the production of ethanol lends itself to more air pollution, which contributes to the bee population in a negative way. Now you might be asking, Christopher, why are we using the example of ethanol as an example of interest groups and their impact on society? And it's because it spoke to our general concern for the environment. You see, a lot of us concern ourselves with fossil fuels and, reducing our dependency on fossil fuels. But in doing so, we were susceptible as a population towards the kind of big shiny object, the alternative, in this case, ethanol. And so, the ethanol interest group lobby successfully went through a mass media campaign, forcing many of us to pressure government to make a law, make an act to include ethanol in the general mix of fuel, and that resulted in more ethanol. But what we weren't privy to were the downsides of ethanol, which we're only finding out now, 15 to 20 years after the enactment of that law. And so that's the real impact that interest groups have. They can co-opt government by preying on our kind of want to see some type of government action being taken. Interest groups are really just a component of democracy. If we want decisions to not rest with the president or the prime minister alone, we want decisions to be vetted in the Senate and the House and various MPs, MPPs, members of Congress, senators, etc. It lends itself to complex government, and no one's really going to understand where decision really lies. And so interest groups, by their nature, swoop in. So I think a happy medium is this. Listen, interest groups play a very important role in our government because of the complexity of it. But I think as civil society, as people, we have to recognize when interest groups exist. And it's not nearly as overt as, the NRA talking about how gun ownership is so important. It could be as subtle as taking your concern, let's say for the environment, climate change, etc., and then putting forward policies that may or may not be reflective of saving the environment, but have ulterior motives at play. So I think as civil society, we have to be more open and okay open to understanding when we're being co-opted by interest groups themselves. So I think as a society, I think the way we combat this is we have as many different opinions, we hear from as many different perspectives as we can as a way to combat these powerful interest groups that may be co-opting us.